8th. This was accordingly done as the governor had stated, and he soon arrived at Longwood himself and was shortly afterwards followed by the admiral and all the civil and military authorities. The weather was beautiful, the roads were crowded with people, and the hills covered with musicians. Never had so mournful and solemn a spectacle been before exhibited in the island. At 12:30, the grenadiers took the coffin, which they could not lift without difficulty, and after repeated and persevering efforts, succeeded in carrying it to and placing it on the hearse, which was waiting in the great walk in the garden, and it was then covered with a violet-colored velvet cloth and the cloak which Napoleon wore at Marengo. The emperor's household was in mourning, and the funeral procession was arranged and proceeded in the following order, which had been regulated by the governor himself. Abbe Vignali, habited in the sacerdotal ornaments used for the celebration of Mass, with young Henri Bertrand carrying a vase of silver containing holy water and the aspersorium. Dr. Not and myself, the persons appointed to take care of the hearse, which was drawn by 4 horses, led by grooms, and escorted by 12 grenadiers on each side without arms. Young Napoleon Bertrand and Marchand, both on foot, on each side of the hearse. Counts Bertrand and Montsalon on horseback, immediately behind the hearse. Part of the emperor's suite, Countess Bertrand with her daughter Hortense, in a calash drawn by 2 horses, led by servants who walked on the side of the precipice. The emperor's horse, led by his piqueur, Archambault. The officers of the Marines on foot and on horseback. The officers of the staff on horseback, General Coffin and the Marquis Montchenu on horseback. The admiral and the governor on horseback. The inhabitants of the island. The procession left Longwood in this order, passed before the guardhouse and the garrison of the island, about 2,500 strong, which lined the whole of the left side of the road as far as Hut's Gate. Bands of music stationed at intervals added by their mournful sounds to the solemn sadness of the ceremony. After the procession had passed before the troops, they followed and accompanied it towards the place of burial. The dragoons marched first, the 20th Regiment of Infantry followed, then came the Marines, the 66th Regiment, the Volunteers of St. Helena, and lastly, the Regiment of Royal Artillery, with 15 pieces of cannon. Lady Lowe and her daughter were waiting on the road at Hut's Gate in a calash drawn by 2 horses, and afterwards followed the procession at a distance, accompanied by some servants in mourning. The 15 pieces of cannon were stationed along the road, and the men were near their pieces ready to fire. At about a quarter of a mile beyond Hut's Gate, the hearse stopped, and the troops halted and ranged themselves in order to battle along the road. The grenadiers took the coffin on their shoulders and carried it thus to the grave by the new road, which had been made for that purpose on the side of the mountain. Everybody then dismounted, the ladies got out of the calash, and the procession followed the corpse without observing any order. Counts Bertrand and Montsalon, Marchand and young Napoleon Bertrand, holding the 4 corners of the pall. The coffin was deposited on the edge of the grave, which was hung with black, and near to it were the machinery and the ropes with which it was to be lowered. Everything offered a very mournful aspect. Everything contributed to increase the grief and affliction which filled our hearts. Our emotions was very deep and concentrated and silent. The coffin, having been uncovered by Abbe Vignali, recited the usual prayers, and the body was consigned to the grave. The feet turned towards the east. The artillery then fired 3 successive volleys of 15 guns each during the march of the funeral procession. The admiral's ship had fired 25 minute guns. An enormous stone, which was to have been employed in the construction of the emperor's new house, was now used to close his grave. The religious ceremonies being over, that stone was lifted up by means of a ring fixed in it and was lowered down over the body, resting on both sides on a strong stone wall so as not to touch the coffin. It was then fastened. The ring was taken away, the hole it had left filled up, and the masonry covered with a layer of cement. Whilst these last arrangements were being made, the crowd rushed eagerly towards the willows, which the presence of Napoleon had already rendered objects of veneration. Everyone wished to have branches or leaves from those trees that were to shade the grave of that great man, and to keep them in remembrance of this mournful and imposing scene. Hudson and the admiral, displeased at this spontaneous manifestation of feeling, endeavored to check it by anger and threats. But this had no other effect than that of increasing the activity of the assailants. And the willows were entirely stripped as high as the hand could reach. Hudson was pale with rage, but the guilty were numerous and of all classes of people, and he could therefore not punish. He, however, took his revenge by prohibiting all approach to the grave, which he surrounded by a barrier, and near which he placed 2 sentries and a guard of 12 men, with an officer adding that such a guard would be perpetually stationed there.